Welcome to session 3 of how to get through what you're going through. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you planned something out, but things didn't go according to plan? Of course. We've all experienced that. Well, as we move forward in this series, we're wrestling with this question. How will we respond in times of challenged faith? How will we respond to our pain and times of suffering? Our response is crucial because often it will determine whether or not we ever develop what we call a living faith. As we take a look at the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 34, we read a somewhat disturbing story. Moses, who's been the leader of the Israelites, is taken to the top of Mount Nebo to see the promised land that the Israelites are about to enter. And as he's looking out over the land, God tells him that he will not be allowed to cross over into it. And shortly thereafter, Moses dies. Moses dies without being able to cross into the promised land that he spent the bulk of his life struggling to get the Israelites into. His dream is never fulfilled in the way that he thought it would be. I don't like this part of the story because it reminds me that sometimes things don't go the way that I want them to in my own life. I'm sure you don't like that either. We all have curveballs that life has thrown our way, massive things that we're going through that we never asked for and we never wanted. 40 years before this moment, the Israelites had stood on the brink of entering into the promised land, but they grew afraid of the challenge, and instead of taking hold of what God was calling them to, they simply began to complain that they couldn't do it. And so because of this, God made them wander around in the desert for 40 years until everyone from that generation of Israelites passed away. Only their children and two of the original Israelite spies, Joshua and Caleb, would actually enter into the land. Perhaps why this story bothers me is because it forces me to face a very uncomfortable question. What if I am never delivered from my suffering? What if I never receive what I've longed for and hoped for and prayed for? What if getting through what I'm going through doesn't mean that the pain goes away? What then? Well, one thing that we want to recognize is that we don't have a lot of answers to the question of why we suffer. Sometimes we suffer because of a bad decision we've made, or maybe it's a result of the decision of others. But then there's those times when we just don't know why we suffer. And no matter how our friends try to explain it, they can't, because there is no answer. We can't always answer the why question. But what we want to do is try and answer the how question. How do we get through the tough times when life just isn't going the way that we thought it would? We can give our suffering deeper meaning by the way that we respond to it. It's our response to pain and our response to the heartache that determines whether our suffering will have any deeper meaning. Moses didn't enter into the promised land, but that doesn't mean he was a failure. But sometimes we feel like a failure because even though we've worked hard, life hasn't turned out the way we thought it would. What we need to remember is that we are a part of a much larger story. Life is not all about us, and there's nothing like suffering to remind us of this reality. Moses played a huge role in God's larger story, and you and I have a role to play in it as well. Even if we aren't delivered from the pain and the suffering that we face in this life, are we willing to play our part in the larger story? Will we choose to rest in God, knowing that our suffering may somehow play a part in what God is doing, even though we may never know? This will be a great time for your small group to encourage one another. So have a great small group.